Hello, my name is Eric Lund. I'm a senior economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to this episode of Global Horizons. Today we'll be discussing the global framework for collaboration on trade and intellectual property. Global Horizons is a joint production between the Conference Board and Oxford Analytica. Before we begin, I want to remind the audience that you have the ability to earn CPE credits on today's webcast. Make sure to stay online for the entire webcast. There'll be 3 pop-ups over the course of the next hour that you'll need to click on, and you'll need to enter your information at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to hand over the presentation to my colleague and co-moderator, Megha Kumar at Oxford Analytica. Megha, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit more about the presentation today and introduce.
Thank you, Eric. So the world economy is recovering from the deepest and broadest recession since the Second World War. During the pandemic, some trading sectors such as finance and e-commerce have done well, but others, especially tourism, have tanked. Protectionism and regionalism are also rising risks. Over the next 1 hour, we will drill down into these issues, dividing our discussion in 4 segments. The first will focus on the macroeconomic and multilateral issues that we face in the trade and IT landscape. The second will focus specifically on multilateral institutions and how they are adapting or not to the changes. The third will focus on the impact of these shifts on businesses and how they can prepare. And in the fourth and final segment, we will open the floor to questions. Please use the box on the bottom left corner of your screen and send us a question at any time during this webcast. We will endeavor to answer as many questions as possible. For our discussion today, I am joined today by an excellent panel. Anthony Taubman joins us from the WTO. Xiang Fan is from the World Economic Forum. James Gerkis joins us from Proskauer Rose. As Eric said in the beginning, I'm Megha Kumar, Deputy Director at Oxford Analytica, and Eric and I will be co-moderating this session today. So let's get into our first segment right away.
Great, thanks so much, Megha. So as Megha mentioned, first we're going to launch into a discussion on the global macroeconomic and political challenges to trade and IT at the moment. But we want to go ahead, as opposed to hearing from us straight off the bat, we want to actually ask the audience a question. So we have a poll question here. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted global trade and supply chains and led many companies to reassess their global supply networks. Looking ahead, is your company A, localizing supply networks to moderate cross-border risk, B, making no changes to its supply chains, or C, further globalizing its supply chains? So take a few moments to think about the perspective from your organization, and then we'll close out the poll and respond to what you're telling us. Let's give it a few more seconds if we can. And if we can go ahead and lock that poll up, please. So it looks like about 50% of the audience, their firms are not changing supply chain structures, either lengthening or shortening. About 40% or so are further globalizing their supply chain networks, and only about 13% are looking to bring things a little more local. It's an interesting distribution there. I thought maybe, given what we're reading in the media, we might have a little more on the localizing supply network vote. Megha, do you have any response to this? What are your thoughts on what the audience is telling us? You're muted, Megha.
I think this is sort of in line with what we are seeing at Oxford Analytica, because there is a lot of uncertainty And I think people want to see how the chips will fall.
What about you, James? Any thoughts on the audience poll result?
Especially given what we all have been reading in the media. I'd be interested in drilling down on this at another one of your sessions.
Any thoughts?
Just one comment.
Anthony, any thoughts?
Just one comment. There's a tendency to assume it's a binary choice between localization and renewed globalization or maintained globalization. One thing that we've seen is diversification and a move from traditional sources, perhaps, as a kind of a hedge against trade shocks. So it's not necessarily we'll stay global or we'll go local. It's at least diversification.
No, that makes sense. It is a bit binary. I apologize. I'm the one who wrote the poll question. As the young, any thoughts?
Similarly, it's not about localizing or globalizing. It's actually about digitizing the supply chain. Because when COVID first happened, a lot of the issues folks encountered is that they did not have visibility. The supply chain traditionally didn't rely too much on people, on physical paper documents. So that was the issue. So you probably heard this year the buzzword of the year for supply chain is resilience. It's how do we build resilience? It's not just efficiency, but resilience. So digitizing the supply chain has been a trend this year, especially since the pandemic happened.
No, that's a great point. And with that, actually, I want to transition a little bit into the main topic for this portion of the webcast on the economic and political trends underlying what we're seeing at the moment. Anthony, in recent years, we've seen increased focus on the knowledge component of trade. What are the implications of the IP system in forging the links in global production networks?
Well, I'm head of something called the Intellectual Property Division in something called the World Trade Organization, and one of the intriguing parts of that job is that we have fantastic trade economists who are still very uncomfortable with the idea of IP as having not much to do with trade, a behind-the-border regulatory issue, and part of our work at the moment is to try and almost create a common lexicon to understand what's going on here. Because we are seeing, as Jian Fan has just mentioned, we are seeing an increased focus on digitization, and a lot of the content, the intangible content, is traded as bundles of IP. Whether we're talking in the way that global production chains are structured, or the move towards trade in intangible goods in themselves, and I would argue at least that the IP system as a network of interlocking domestic legal systems is part of the backbone, is part of the, if you like, the legal infrastructure of this cross-border knowledge flows. But we're still, I mean, the metrics are still not very good. The raw statistics, but also the way we look at them. I think everyone knows instinctively, and we've all read Paul Romer. We know that knowledge is endogenous to economic growth. We're conscious that trade and the development of global production chains leads to knowledge spillovers and economic development. But I think we're still struggling to get a really clear, convincing picture of how this works and feeding that into policy making. So IP is still a bit of an orphan in the trade policy world. It's still a bit of a black box. But to really try and tease that out, that's the big reason why I've joined in today.
Thanks very much, Anthony. James, I want to pivot a little bit off of that question. In the 1990s and the 2000s, we saw the manufacturing supply chain really fragment and go global. But in a lot of ways, the services industries haven't really followed suit to the same degree. But with the acceleration of the adoption of telecommunications and telework, really, that we've seen in 2020, what's your outlook? What are your thoughts in terms of service production and whether or not that stays more localized or if that fragments in sort of the same way that manufacturing did with the previous?
That's a very good question. I mean, today there is higher growth in the trade of services compared to the trade of goods, both in the developing world. And also the distinction between goods and services is becoming less clear and more muddled as businesses adopt goods as a service model. For example, software subscriptions. It used to be bought a piece of software, put it in your computer, downloaded it, and it was yours. And now you spend money every year subscribing, like Office 365. Technological advances have created the opportunity for businesses, such as my firms, to outsource more services and to facilitate data flow. Major companies, law firms, accounting firms, all pretty much outsource document production, word processing, and the like. The costs have decreased rapidly over the last decade in being able to outsource these services, and virtual service delivery has really become seamless. And we've seen that, especially since, as I mentioned earlier to my fellow panelists, I haven't been to the office since March 12th. And I was shocked at how seamless our firm has been able to conduct business, almost business as usual. Also, telemedicine, especially now in the United States, the insurance companies now pay and reimburse for virtual doctor's visits. And a lot of this has really been, due to the technology just simply getting much better and better. And the trend will continue that way as 5G networks and cloud services and the infrastructure related thereto, build out. So I see it increasing and increasing more and more.
Thanks, James. And I want to, we touched a little bit. I think your comments kind of buttress up against some of the political dimensions of what we've been seeing recently. For the last 5 years or so, especially in advanced economies, we've been seeing more political nativism and sort of populism on both sides of the Atlantic, really. So, Yang, I wanted to get your perspective on that. Has COVID changed that narrative, or as we exit the pandemic into 2021, do you think a lot of the momentum behind those political trends are likely to stick around?
Good question, a tough one. I think when the pandemic first started, we witnessed some closing of borders, export controls, especially on certain supplies such as medical devices. But what's interesting is that as pandemic went on, we've actually seen more opening from places. So I have read this report saying that during the same period of early 2020 till about October, 215 jurisdictions implemented export controls or tightening, but 240 jurisdictions enacted import relaxation. So you actually can see the trend toward swing back the other way a bit, because I think folks realize that they do need trade to get supplies, especially if you look at when the vaccines are being distributed. A lot of countries will be receiving them probably overseas through trade. You need trade for economic recovery, and also since I run digital trade, I have to say that digital trade has been crucial in this space. As James just mentioned, teleconferencing, telemedicine, e-commerce, digital payment, digitizing the supply chain. I think folks are also realizing, that the digitizing aspect of trade is helping them. So, and just last, I'll say, trade itself is never the goal. Right? It's really linked to the end, to more equality, more prosperity, and inclusion. So, really hope that the narrative can or keep shifting towards that direction. Thank you.
Sure, of course. No. And I wonder specifically about the trade relationship that's seen the most disruption over the last several years has been the U.S.-China relationship. James, do you have any thoughts on what kind of direction that relationship goes in under a Biden administration? Are we looking possibly to turn the heat on that down a little bit, or to continue to be a rocky economic and trade relationship?
I happen to agree with what many of the leading commentators have said on this subject, including Oxford Analytica. Joe Biden's election as president will offer the chance of a modest reset. But my personal view is that it actually will be more more stylistic rather than substantive. The economic and diplomatic measures initiated by the Trump administration against China likely will slow, and the Biden administration will take a more traditional diplomatic approach in using the State Department more and more as past administrations have done. I think they'll also attempt to compartmentalize areas of conflict from areas of cooperation, or potential cooperation. For example, on climate change, China has announced a 2260 net zero emissions deadline for itself. Nonetheless, fundamental conflicts of interest, political, economic, and business, will remain and perhaps even grow. Views, at least in the United States, of China across the political spectrum and the business community, have rapidly changed over the last decade. China is viewed as not only as a competitor, but in many respects a hostile one, and it'll take some time for those views to dissipate or disappear. So I think President Biden will take a tough but balanced approach. I also, I'm sure he will, as he has said, that he'll start working with traditional allies of the United States and use multi-trade agreements to basically, hinder some of China's efforts. However, regarding tariffs, I think the President-elect has said that he's not inclined to initially roll back all the tariffs that Trump instituted, and that he probably will focus on bringing supply chains back to the United States from China, in many respects decreasing dependency. And on the flip side, China, also has certain supply chain problems. For example, China is the world's largest consumer of semiconductors. They expect to spend $300 billion this year on importing semiconductors, and in 2019 they only produced 16% of what they consume domestically. So they're highly dependent on foreign chip makers, and I'm sure the Chinese government will seek to change that.
No, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, James. I want to pivot a little bit. We're talking about a bilateral relationship there, but multilateralism is alive and well, and we really need to talk about that. My colleague Mega is going to dive into that. Mega, do you want to lead the poll question?
Yeah, no, I can do that. Let's get into it. So the WTO will retain a central role in governing global trade over the coming decade. Based on your current knowledge, do you agree the WTO will remain central? Partially agree. The WTO will play a role, but in only some aspects like dispute resolution. Or disagree. The WTO's significance will fade significantly as regional trade pacts proliferate. Let's just give this a few more seconds. Well, I think the verdict is pretty clear and sliding in one direction, which is partially agree. The WTO will retain its significance, but perhaps more so in some areas such as dispute resolution as opposed to others. I want to do a quick round around our panel to see whether you are surprised, whether you would agree, whether you would have made the same decision. Jian.
I'm a trade lawyer, when started, so WTO always will have a soft spot in my heart. I think, yeah, I agree. I think, there's some reforms needed, but I think WTO actually can play a more important role going forward, for example, a lot of issues on digital, for example. And also the past couple years, if anything, it really brought trade and WTO to, to the first half of the fold, right? It's become a really it's an issue that a lot of people are familiar with now, so it might help that.
Okay, James. James, are you muted?
There are areas of significant reform that I believe that the WTO, through no fault of its own, needs to address. I mean, the rules were implemented in 1995 when the WTO first came into being, and the world has changed a lot in the last 25 years, and I think these rules and practices need to change as well. For example, the WTO's approach to developing country status. I mean, countries, nation-states self-declare their status. There is no definition of what is considered a developing country. For example, China and India consider themselves developing countries, and developing countries get special treatment, favorable terms, extra time to fulfill commitments, and I think a lot of countries, both developing and developed, don't understand why China is viewed as a developing country within the WTO framework. And I think the rules of the WTO need to be reformed or updated really in the areas of e-commerce and digital trade. And another area in which the rules should be looked at are in terms of dealing with state-owned enterprises.
Good. So Anthony, you must be in the 30%. Given that you're from the WTO, you can't possibly say that you're in the 60%.
Well, yes, I have a certain vested interest and a certain lack of objectivity, and I also have a job to keep, so I'm somewhat constrained. But I would comment that there's a tendency to look at the WTO through negotiations, norm setting, and in terms of dispute settlement, because that's the part that sort of breaks the surface and is most dramatic. But there's a lot of work. A big part of our work is more mundane, but to my mind, actually, just as significant. Whether it's trade policy monitoring, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's policy support, whether it's engagement with the multilateral community. At the moment, as you can imagine, public health is a critical concern, and we work closely with partners across the multilateral system, regional players, and so on. So that's kind of building a foundation for policy making, for reviewing, and I hope too, in time, updating and renewing the norms. But that policy support and that transparency work actually has, and technical assistance support for developing countries, that arguably in some areas has actually more impact than just creating new rules for the sake of it. I'm not suggesting that's on the table. But and also when it comes to dispute settlement, there's been a huge proliferation of bilateral and regional norm setting, of course, very significant in most areas of trade and related areas of economic policy. However, dispute settlement is relatively rare in those systems, very rare in fact, and so we do see, in spite of the current difficulties at the appellate level, we're still seeing a continuing trust in the dispute settlement system. So even when there is an option, when there's an option for forum shopping, there's still a tendency to come to the WTO.
Anthony, let me stick with you and press you a little bit more on this issue of reforms. You mentioned in the previous segment that there is a need, for example, to develop a common lexicon. But do you think overall the norms around intellectual property rights, as they are being forged in the multilateral fora, are they keeping up with the needs of the global knowledge economy?
Well, no, it's a striking situation. Our agreement on intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, was essentially concluded in 92, 93 at the latest, for the most part. And that was just minutes before the internet kind of expanded and as a consumer tool, as a tool of commerce, as a tool of sharing content. and of course completely upended the intellectual property system, the way IP rights are defined, managed, enforced, shared. And so on the face of it, it looks like it's sort of automatically out of date. It's a sort of ironic matter that they were negotiating the TRIPS agreement here in Geneva, and just a few tram stops down the road, Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the World Wide Web at the same time, but there was actually no linkage between these two processes. And we know that in bilateral and regional trade agreements there's been a large amount of new norm setting on the IP front, specifically on matters such as enforcement of IP in the digital environment, or other normative matters such as internet service provider liability, these kind of significant issues. And at the same time, on parallel tracks, we see work on digital trade as such, recognising the significance of digital products which are shaped by IP, which are often traded as IP, bundles of IP rights. And so our rules are apparently out of date, embedded in an analogue era because technology has moved on, trade agreements have moved on. That said, I think that the principles, because the TRIPS agreement is a set of principles, it's not a model law, it's not a model legislation, it's a set of broader principles, which is to some extent technology neutral. And I think that the principles as such hold good. However, we certainly need, at the first step, we need to have a more intensive conversation about how members have actually, our member governments have applied those principles in the digital age, in the e-commerce environment, and to at least have initially have a process of mutual learning, because that hasn't taken place fully yet. Then you've got a better basis to say, well, look, there's all this bilateral regional norm setting activity. We're just getting a hold of that because it's going in different directions. Equally, we're learning as we go in terms of reshaping the intellectual property system for the digital environment. When can these converge and lead to a TRIPS 2.0? Nobody's ready for that politically, procedurally. Nobody's ready to embark on those negotiations, but I am convinced that time will come. At the moment, it's a matter of doing spade work and building the foundation for that future norm setting. I'd love to, professionally, I'd love to start that tomorrow, but politically, procedurally, there isn't yet the appetite for it.
Great. Xian, let me go to you now. It's sort of, Anthony has objectively conceded that, some rules are perhaps stuck in the analog era. Do you see the current trade rules as being suitable? What are the shortcomings from your point of view?
I absolutely agree. What's interesting is that we talk about the traditional sector and then we talk about digital sector, but the lines were blurring by the day. What was considering, conventional is now very much digital, and for example, car manufacturing is a perfect example. Nowadays, cars, you can say they're just computers on four wheels. Right, and more so as we move towards autonomous driving. So, but the core principles of the trade definitely still applies. Non-discrimination, fair competition. For example, we can see that being applied in data flows, in financial services, and we're seeing more. And my hope as well that we both have been witnessing, and I hope we'll see more of the digital trade pact to catch up with the times. Firstly, many of the regional agreements have added a fairly robust digital trade chapter from USMCA to CPTPP, and now we're seeing trade agreements that are kind of have digital as a front and center. For example, the DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So that is a great example between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. That has digital economy as the front and center at how they drafted this agreement. Included not just on digital e-commerce, but also including chapter provisions on artificial intelligence, blockchain. So really forward-looking, and we do hope to see more and more of that down the road. And from the forum part, it was at the annual meeting of 2019, so almost 2 years ago, where over 70 at that time, now over 80 countries got together and started e-commerce discussion at the sideline of Davos. So we really hope that the trend will continue. As because as just Anthony James said, that the economy is shifting. The trade has to catch up at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. James, let me turn to you now. From a business perspective, what reforms do you think the WTO must implement in order to stay relevant in this era of protectionism and regional tax? The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has just been signed by 15 countries, including China. What do you need to see happen at the WTO level?
Well, as Anthony said, the WTO rules are supposed to be technologically neutral. New ways to conduct trade should not change the rights or the obligations of the members of the WTO. The issue is I think, many members in this digital age have, some seriously conflicting views. Take data privacy. The views of the EU versus the views of the U.S. are, very starkly different. And it's every time I log into an EU-based company's website, I get a series of questions of how I want my data tracked. For example, China's approach to facilitate e-commerce and the internet is a state-driven model, and they're not going to move away from that anytime soon. And that doesn't align with the positions of many of the other developed countries, such as the United States and nations in Europe. And competition concerns. As everyone on this webcast knows, there are a handful of major firms that drive the entire digital and data market. Does the WTO need to implement procedures to facilitate anti-competitive practices in the digital age? How can you get alignment of the different members on this issue? So I have a lot of questions, but not many answers on this subject.
Well, with that, let's move to the business dimension of the challenges that lie ahead. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Megha. So we've talked a little bit about the economic and political dimensions of this, about how multilateral institutions like the WTO are coping with some of the changes that we're seeing. But what does this really mean for businesses? How does a business leader navigate these waters, especially as we exit 2020 and start to hopefully get back to a semblance of normality in 2021? So I think I wanted to start out by asking Anthony, how should businesses think about intellectual property, procurement, and competition in a global perspective as they relate to international trade in the future?
My division in the system is a very interesting one, because it's in a sense it's got the two hard baskets that the mainstream trade experts are uneasy about. One is intellectual property, one is government procurement policy, and one is competition policy. And they're at very different stages in a structural sense in the WTO, but we do view them as in a collective way, because they are areas where government policy choices, where legislation, where the implementation of regulation not only shapes domestic markets, but shapes global markets. And it's important to understand the interrelationship between these. The glaring example of that at the moment is, of course, in the public health area, in access to medicines, in the steps that governments are taking to get hold of necessary protective equipment, treatments, vaccines, because ultimately this is a challenge for procurement, for public procurement, in the sense that this is public money going to feed into the marketplace. We know that broadly speaking, broadly speaking, 20% of GDP is in the form of public procurement of some sort. That's a very significant market. It's a very significant chunk of international trade in goods and services. And we know that the traditional balance between intellectual property and competition policy is extremely important in ensuring that innovation remains vital, dynamic, productive, but at the same time, intellectual property rights don't overstep the mark and interfere with legitimate competition. So in a practical sense, for businesses, I think it's important to understand the scale of the issues at stake, the idea that these three interlocking areas of public policy, if you like, of regulation, of, if you like, government intervention in the marketplace, these do have an enormous impact, not only on the domestic economic scene, but on international markets, on international trade. We are working to get a more coherent picture of how these fit together, beginning initially with the public health sector, because that's where the instant priority is, but then more broadly. And the key message is that this is not a kind of a geek out. This is not a sort of a fascinating abstract academic discussion, but a very practical one, because we know from working with our member governments, 164 member governments, that there's not necessarily, and this is not singling out anyone, there's not very good coordination between these areas. There's not a strong policy dialogue across the different regulatory agencies involved. And one thing we are trying to do as an international organisation is to encourage models of governance in these areas that take a holistic approach, that understand how all these areas fit together. I think that's the real message. Is that ultimately the dialogue between government and industry has to focus on yes, the necessity for regulation in this area. We need an IP system, but not one that's going over the top. We need a public procurement system that serves social goals, but also is competitive and makes effective use of public funds. And we need a competition policy that avoids dominant positions, that avoids the obstruction to beneficial competition. And this is a challenge for governments across the whole spectrum. So it's a real chance for business to engage and to encourage that kind of mutually supportive, holistic approach, rather than different agencies not talking to each other or competing with each other.
Great. Thanks so much, Anthony. A really interesting and well thought out response. Ziyang, I put you on the spot earlier in the webcast and asked about political nativism and populism coming out of COVID-19. What about intellectual property, policies? What are business leaders going to walk into in 2021 on this front? Is it going to be anything starkly different from what they had prior to the pandemic, or are there any burning kind of elements?
Predicting the future is always hard, but since I get stuck with this, I'll give it a shot. I think maybe two challenges and one opportunities. One on the IP front, I think the enforcement might be difficult in certain cases. For example, courts. In certain cases, courts are closed and travel remain challenging. Just for example, just last month, Eastern District of Texas, which oversees a lot of patent cases, they postponed the jury trial, I think, until next spring. I think they will can see some delays there. So that's one. And two, also been witnessing trend of suspension of IP rights, either out of necessity or voluntarily. That, for example, during the pandemic, I remember there was a case, I think it was an Italian company that 3D printed this valve for the ventilator, right? It was held as a heroic act, was great, but at the same time raised some IP issues because they just kind of printed with that. So I think, but at the same time, we also see companies stepping up and say, you know what, we're not going to enforce some of that. Moderna, I think, recently in October, said that they're not going to enforce the COVID-19, the patent rights on the vaccine during the pandemic. So we've seen both sides. I think one opportunity is that because of all the investments, especially in the healthcare area and the more digitized economy, we might see more innovation that do come out of the pandemic. Thank you.
James, similar question for IT-intensive businesses. What kinds of challenges and opportunities might they face?
The opportunities are
looking
enormous.
into the decade.
IP-intensive businesses, drive not only individual nation states' domestic economies, but the global economies, and it will continue to do so. Software industry, healthcare industries, they're seemingly recession-proof. The Great Recession, 10 years ago, software and healthcare, no jobs were lost. In fact, jobs were gained. And that's probably the case even today. Governments, are really interested in being at the forefront of IP-intensive businesses and, providing funding, subsidies, as we've seen, as Yang mentioned, with the rapid development of vaccines for COVID-19. Super sophisticated contact tracing technology. There are lots of risks, obviously, cybersecurity, espionage, IP theft, ransomware attacks on, hospitals, service businesses, cities, and the legal framework, even outside the WTO, has to evolve, to meet a lot of these challenges.
Thanks very much, James. I have one more quick question for Ziyang. You mentioned you rattled off a couple of different trade agreements earlier in the webcast. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Plan, was just signed by China, and some of the other countries still need to ratify it. What's your take on RCEP? What's your take on TPP? A potential revival in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what does all this mean for IT?
Put my lawyer hat back on if I'm advising IT-intensive company right now. I'll say for RCEP, not so much in the short term. I think the IP chapter 11. I think in RCEP agreement, a lot of the provisions are already in place. And also, I think what's more the significance of RCEP is more on the geopolitical and economical. So I think that's the way you should think about it. It's, in a way, it's ASEAN-led. I think that's another thing I think folks I would suggest that it's ASEAN-led. It's ASEAN +5. So the ASEAN countries being in the driver's seat and making this happen. I think that's important. That if you look at the ASEAN agreement, they tend to start modestly, but it's a consensus-based model, and they will grow over time. So I think over time we will see we'll have more impact, but in the short term, I think it's really the economic and geopolitical significance of RCEP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I muted myself there for a second. I've been able to ask a lot of questions of all of you. I want to give Megha the opportunity to close out and to field some of the questions we've seen from the audience. Again, if you have any questions, put them down in text on the bottom.
Thank you, Eric. James, I want to start with you because you mentioned developing countries right at the beginning. So do you think it's in the interest of, large emerging economies, India, Brazil, Nigeria, to rally behind the WTO, if only to prevent China from becoming the dominant ruler?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. If large emerging markets, such as the countries you mentioned, don't ally with the WTO, then basically going to allow China, to dominate the rulemaking proceedings in the WTO, according to a lot of people. I have to agree with that view. Obviously, China is a very important country in the world, and it needs to have a place in the WTO and in the rulemaking function. It's not a question of eliminating China, obviously, but making sure that there's a wide range of views and that lots of countries sit at the table. But I think countries like India and Brazil and Nigeria and other emerging markets, that not only have to continue to support the WTO, but they need to be actively engaged in it. There's lots of diverse international interests and concerns, and there needs to be a healthy engagement among the members.
Okay. Xian, could I go to you with one of the questions we have from the audience present? Perhaps Anthony would like to follow up as well. So we have a question about the international investment policy, and the fact that a lot of countries are now screening investment into particular countries. How do you see that affecting IP rights?
Yeah, I think that's what we've been seeing is that the old investment policies are in place, but we also need new investment policies for the digital age. It's actually we have a project rolling out called the DFDI, Digital FDI, that would really look at the digital infrastructure that put innovation and IP issues in the front and center when you are designing and drafting those investment policies, and not as a back end trying to fit the current innovation and IP intensive industries into the old mode. So that's hopefully we'll see more of that happening down the road as well.
Okay, Anthony, would you like to follow up or disagree or build on something Xian has said?
Certainly wouldn't want to disagree. I think it is an area that needs a lot of careful attention. We've spoken of bilateral trade agreements, of which there are hundreds. There are thousands of bilateral investment treaties, and almost all of them cover IP in some form as an investment. And it does raise questions both for domestic policy, because IP takes on different forms. The same IP right is, on the one hand, a legal right granted under IP law. It's also treated as an investment, as an asset. We saw this come to a head with the recent plain packaging tobacco litigations, and a very interesting case under NAFTA concerning quite technical issues on patentability were dealt with as an investment issue in the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. For me, it is an important recognition that the way that you manage your domestic IP system is part of the investor-friendly infrastructure, and on the other hand, disruptions or appropriations of IP potentially impair the flow of knowledge-based investment, evidently. But there is a regulatory tension there that hasn't been fully resolved, and it's for me it's an area that needs greater illumination, because it is becoming an issue. It's notable that, for instance, it's one area that's leading to some reluctance on the part of governments to enter into investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, or new ones, or even talking about withdrawing from existing ones. So I think we do need to understand more clearly the IP dimension of investment treaties, and I don't think that the necessary spade work has been done.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. James, I'd like to turn to you now. This is a sort of pressing question that I'm sure a lot of our participants have on the top of their minds. What is the U.S. position going to be now that we're going to have a Biden administration? Because the Trump administration was quite isolationist.
It certainly was. Joe Biden has been very clear. He intends to re-engage with traditional allies, and I think he will engage with multinational organizations. Again, I think it's going to be that will be, I think, a complete reset or reversal of a lot of the Trump administration policies. Not necessarily, vis-a-vis some of the trade issues that we've been talking about, but it's going to be, I think, a wholly different approach.
Okay. Liang, I want to go to you next and stick with the issue of the United States. One of the things that we expect the Biden administration to do is, for example, to push digital trade pacts with regions such as Southeast Asia, which are booming in terms of their digital economy. Do you see the U.S. prioritizing these pacts more widely?
I think we're definitely more hopeful when it comes to the digital front. I think it makes sense. I think there is a demand domestically. U.S. is the leading exporter of services, including financial services, IT services. So there's a demand there, and then also geopolitically, also makes sense to build out, the sphere of influence. If you look at, EU has their thing, China is pushing its agenda. So I think it makes sense as well. And it also, last thing, look at the track record in the past couple of years. U.S. has been pushing that. USMCA has a digital trade chapter. U.S. and Japan also included a digital trade chapter as well. So I think, yeah, hopefully we'll see more of that down the road. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Liang. Anthony, I want to go to you next about the shortcomings of the intellectual property rights framework, and we've discussed it pretty extensively during this webcast. Could you say a little bit more about what implications this has for trade policy in next year, definitely, but also perhaps in the medium term?
Well, I think a major chunk of the value that's exchanged internationally, the content, the commercial content, the knowledge content, is defined and structured by IP transactions internationally. But they're difficult by definition to count, to measure. When our imports of software could be literally counted by somebody at the border, counting boxes of shrink wrap boxes entering and leaving, that was a clear, tangible measure of trade. Now it's extremely hard to find out and to develop strong metrics. And so, at a time when against the recommendations of our trade economists, there's a strong focus, for example, on trade deficits, and that there's a measure of whether you're winning or losing in international trade. It leads to this distortion, this focus on physical things and the value of the, as Negroponte said, the value of the atoms and not of the bits. Whereas, in fact, if you're importing an iPhone, we know that the greater part of that apparent $1,000 trade deficit, a good part of that is actually packages of IP, multiple packages of IP, and trading in IP licenses. So it's very artificial to view that as a trade deficit of $1,000, but that's the way the system currently works. So we are working to infuse a greater understanding of the IP component of trade, so at least we can start with a more objective and empirically sound understanding of what is going on out there, and I would hope that leads to a greater understanding of the win-win aspect of trading in intellectual property, because it is a means of creating knowledge spillovers, of technology transfer, but also it's there to reward the innovators, the people who create the technology. And that's often constructed as either as a sort of a random imposition of a monopoly, as the opponents of IP say, or at least as a zero-sum game. That's really not how it's meant to work, and I don't think I'm being idealistic in saying that's how it can work, but at the moment we still don't have that understanding of what it means to transact in IP, to trade in IP, as an integral part of international trade, whether it's about goods or services.
Right, and you think the WTO is absolutely up to the task of taking on these challenges and coming up with a framework that is absolutely fit for the digital age?
Absolutely. I have to say we are a member-driven organisation, so it depends on whether our governments think that's important or not. But we are working to at least improve, as I say, the information platform, the empirical platform for the policy debates, for the normative development to take place. Our job as a Secretariat is to build that information platform. It's the job of the governments then to decide how to take it forward.
Thank you, Anthony. I think the hour has defeated us. Thank you, James. Thank you, Xiang. Thank you, Anthony, for your insights and for your candor. Let's bring this discussion to a close with some concluding remarks from Eric.
Thanks so much, Megha, and thank you to our esteemed panel as well. It's been a great conversation today. Thank you to the audience, most of all, for staying with us for the last hour. A few reminders here at the closing. The Global Horizons Virtual Conference for 2021 is on the horizon, the 23rd to the 25th of March 2021. Some great panels are being put together on that front. Geopolitics, ESG, and technology will be some of the key topics discussed. As always, at the Conference Board, we do some very interesting research on the implications of the coronavirus and COVID-19. Please make sure to stop by our website to have a look. And our partners at Oxford Analytica are engaged in a lot of the same research as well. Make sure to take a look at some of their content when you have a